Welcome to the Mission Matters podcast, a podcast from Shield Capital where we explore the technical opportunities and challenges of developing and deploying commercial technology to national security customers. I'm Maggie Gray.
And I'm David Rothzeid.
And we are your hosts from the investment team at Shield Capital. All views expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of their employers or investment advice. References to any securities are for informational purposes only and do not constitute an investment recommendation or offer to provide investment advisory services. Late last week, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth announced a series of reforms to the Department of War's acquisition system. The reforms spanned from renaming the defense acquisition system to changing the way program executive offices actually work. Many of the reforms get pretty deep into the wonky policy weeds, but there's no doubt that once they are implemented, they will be incredibly meaningful for startups working in the space. So, of course, I had to ask my two favorite defense acquisition experts, Mike and David, on my team to help me record a last-minute emergency pod on the subject to help explain what these reforms actually mean for startups working in the national security space. David also just wrote an awesome blog post on the reforms that I'm going to link to in the show notes, so definitely check that out if you want to dive in further. Mike and David, thank you both so much for making the time on a Saturday morning. I know there's no way you all would rather be spending your weekend than diving into the details of defense acquisition reform. I think it's going to be super meaningful for those like me who are not as deep into the wonky policy weeds to really understand what's actually happening here.
Happy to be here, and I think doing this as an emergency pod speaks to the importance of this announcement.
Agreed.
Let's just start with the basics. What are the headlines of what is actually being announced here? Can you just give us a summary overview of what the Secretary's memo meant and what his speech meant?
Yeah, I think maybe before we get into some of the specifics, which are the policy changes, I think reflecting on the themes that the Secretary was highlighting would be important. And I think it really starts with the current system is broken. It's a recognition that not only Secretary Hegseth has had, many secretaries before him and the Congress have had, as there have been many attempts for acquisition reform. So I think he correctly pointed out that it's broader than acquisition per se. It's really a combination of requirements. What are we asking for? Acquisition, how do we buy it? And budgeting, what's the money allocated for this and how flexible is that? So I like the fact that he really was addressing all three. If you just were to change one of those, you don't really get the desired effect. And the desired effect, he spelled out very clearly, speed. He's making speed a priority in all of the different, we'll talk about what he's doing to reinforce that, but he's basically saying we need to move at a faster pace. There's a great piece that Bill Greenwalt and Dan Patt wrote not so long ago called Competing in Time that highlights how badly the system is broken, that it takes on average 17 years to get new capability fielded at the Department of Defense. On the fast end was 7 years, on the long end was 27 years. So that's clearly unacceptable. And the implication of going that slow is we put incredible operational risk on warfighters to fight with yesterday's technology. So he made a couple of points. We need to move faster. We need accountability. So we're going to hold people accountable. We're going to have one person in charge. We'll talk about that through his portfolio acquisition executive idea. And that we need to focus on outcomes over process. Anybody who's spent time at the Pentagon knows that there's an incredible almost a religious fervor about compliance with process. And unfortunately, that doesn't always lead to the best outcome. So he's clearly saying, I want outcomes over process, and I want to advantage the warfighter here with speed. I think those were some of the headlines I took away.
Yeah, I would say just maybe one other area, I think a recognition that the defense industry base is a little bit hamstrung. So one other area that was highlighted and honestly is often forgotten about is like the foreign military sales. Now, I'll admit I don't have any experience. I've never worked in a program office. But when you think about the defense industry base and when they have to comply with ITAR, right, which is basically the technology regime that enforces certain critical technologies to not be exported, it very much limits your market window or your addressable market. And we certainly have a lot of friends and allies that would like to be able to buy technology that, keeps our military as the most lethal fighting force. But that process is so bureaucratic, so slow. And so moving that within the department, putting a little bit more emphasis on allowing foreign military sales to occur at a faster rate should then help the defense industry base make some of the investments in their production capacity that they're currently stymied by.
So obviously, both of you have spent years mired in the acquisition system of the Pentagon, both at Defense Innovation Unit, at the Air Force, and elsewhere. So why is it so important to have these reforms in the first place? What are the implications of the status quo?
I think what's interesting about this moment in time and this memo is how aligned it is with the things that Congress has been asking for years. Secretary Hegseth is not the first to promote change in culture and process and emphasize speed. Secretary Carter, right, who established Defense Innovation Unit, Defense Digital Service, the Strategic Capabilities Office, among a handful of other organizations, also recognized these very same challenges. But I think what we have seen with some of the successes of the organizations that I outlined before is how it has also provided Congress significant proof points insofar as they are asking for a lot of the same things through the National Defense Authorization Act. There's a section in the National Defense Authorization Act that always outlines a bunch of changes and updates and modifications to the overall acquisition system. But since Secretary Carter, there really has not been a great emphasis at the senior leaders at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, or now Office of the Secretary of War, to make these changes, front and center. And here we're just seeing significant prioritization with these massive policy memos that are looking to make wholesale changes. And again, I think because it's so aligned with the things that Senator Wicker, the chair of the Senate Armed Service Committee, put in Forge Act last December, right? And then what we've seen through the House Armed Service Committee with the SPEED Act, which is now sort of on the desk of the Senate to ratify to then become the next FY26 National Defense Authorization Act. These things are so aligned and in concert with one another. And I think it bodes really well for the overall acquisition community.
Yeah, I might add that another thing we've seen is the importance of commercial technology, with a tip of our hat back to Ash Carter, who had that vision going back a few decades. Now we're really seeing that come to the fore, and you saw it in Ukraine. So many technologies that are now produced by commercial companies, whether they're in sensors from space, AI software used for targeting, obviously autonomy. What we've seen on the battlefield in Ukraine is commercial technology being used to great effect, not to the exclusion of some of the traditional platforms and munitions. We see them being used in a complementary fashion. But it's the first time I think we could say that commercial technology has played such an important role in a war. And we're not going to be able to buy the commercial technology we need without the reforms that were outlined in the Secretary's speech.
Yes, I think you both mentioned that this is not the first attempt at defense acquisition reform. Secretary Carter had his own initiatives. Hegseth in his speech actually mentioned that Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had a similar initiative more than 20 years ago. So in your view, what makes this attempt different, and what do we need to learn from past attempts in order to make this set of reforms more successful?
Yeah, well, I think David pointed out a really important factor, which is we're getting all the branches of government together at one time, emphasizing the importance of this. So we have the House, the Senate, and the administration aligned. First time I can remember that we've had a president get involved and issue 4 executive orders focused on defense acquisition. Don't know that that's ever happened before. So I think it speaks to unifying the branches of government to get behind this as an effort. And I think the fact that Secretary Hegseth referred back to Secretary Rumsfeld right before 9/11 making a speech really talks to how hard this is. It really is going to take the entire community of the Defense Department, everyone involved in requirements acquisition and budgeting, as well as the Congress in support. And Secretary Hegseth promised transparency, as well as a speed that he would be looking to Congress to support. I think how hard it is speaks to the fact that we need everyone with hands joined to make this a success. I think one of the things we'll talk about in a few minutes is probably what are the proof points, what will have to happen to make some of these reforms successful. But I think the fact that everyone working together, the technology is now important. We have commercial technology from startup companies that's important, means this is a moment in time when we really need to make these reforms so that we can modernize the military much faster and get warfighters not only the capability they need, but getting it on a timely basis.
I was just going to maybe highlight that because of the war going on in Ukraine, we're seeing how commercial technology can be implemented and advanced and iterated upon in real time. And I think there's just a general recognition, right? And Secretary Hegseth at the beginning of the speech, right, in quoting Donald Rumsfeld, he talked about central planning as the adversary, right? That process being like the over-reliance on process is the enemy. And just knowing that sort of central planning and how that would conform to a live war with something like Ukraine is experiencing with Russia, it just won't work. We had overwhelming technological superiority in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we weren't as concerned about the cost of munitions or the price per kill. In fact, the Congress continued to provide overseas contingency operations funding, right, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So the Pentagon, right, and the services writ large didn't really have to reimagine their warfighting capability to fit what they had at that time. And so we had overwhelming force, but it wasn't economical. And I think today there's a recognition, especially with a peer adversary like the People's Republic of China, that were we to get into a situation that required kinetic force, that how we operate today would really handicap our effectiveness.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention that relates to this being a moment in time is now we have had a decade since the organizations that David referred to that Ash Carter set up have been practicing, tradecraft in acquisition. So in other words, we have proof points from organizations that have been set up, whether it's Defense Innovation Unit, Army Applications Lab, AFWorks, the Rapid Capabilities Offices. So there are ways we can leverage that have already been done on a smaller scale that now can make a much bigger impact when applied to the whole department.
So what will be some of the proof points of a successful implementation of these reforms?
Yeah, well, I think the ultimate proof point will be, can we change that 17 years on average to be 1 or 2 years with commercial technology, and maybe with the establishment of what's called MOSA, Modular Open Systems Approach, we should be able to go faster on the larger defense platforms as well. So I think it really is about speed. And if we look at specifically some of the changes that the Secretary is talking about, they are designed to make speed easier. So whether it's we're going to blow up the JCIDS process, which is the requirements, a part of the process, and how to get to what do we need to buy faster. In fact, we don't need a JCIDS process for commercial technology. We can be buying what's off the shelf. And then using some of the faster ways to procure, I'd point to other transaction authority, which was given to the department a decade ago. DIU used that very effectively. And now many people are taking that and using the process that DIU pioneered, that David pioneered here on this call, the Commercial Solutions Opening. And then having the single accountable executive, again, it's not just a name change to go from a PEO to a portfolio acquisition executive. That allows one person to make the trade-offs of speed versus traditional cost and performance. And the Secretary, I think, made the point that I'd rather have new capability, maybe it's 85% to the way we might have specified in a requirement. I'd rather have that sooner if I'm a warfighter, than wait years, 17 years on average, to get something that meets the requirements fully. So those, I think, would be some of the important proof points, and they all come down to, do we get things faster to the warfighter?
Yeah, that's well said. Maybe moving a little bit more into the specifics, right? So we keep talking about this thing called portfolio acquisition executives versus program executive offices. I think at the macro sense, it's really trying to allow trade space to a senior leader to move across an entire capability area, whether that be munitions, whether that be fighters, and look at what's actually performing well and getting real-time feedback from the test and operational community about what's going to progress from a technology standpoint and being able to make trade-offs inside of that overall portfolio. Now, I think at a procedural level, and if the audience will bear with me, one of the major challenges that the executive branch cannot address on its own is the budgeting process, right? Every year, Congress appropriates funding to the department, and unfortunately, they do it through thousands of lines of programs, right? So each program will have what's called like a program element associated with it. And that's where Congress is saying explicitly, you are going to spend X amount of money on this thing. So maybe it's for a certain set of munitions, maybe it's for a re-engine, upgrading an engine, right? So for like the B-52, or maybe it's for a ground network system. And that really handcuffs the executive branch around making decisions and trade-offs. And so for me, like my first proof point that this is going to be real and effective is if we see the president's budget as it moves from the combatant commanders to the services up through the Office of the Secretary of War, then on to the Office of Management and Budgeting before going and being signed on by the president and sent over to Congress. If we see a consolidation of program elements to portfolio elements, and what we should see are few portfolio elements with much larger capacity and general statements around the types of capabilities that they're going to be getting after, highlighted by this new requirements regime that is moving away from the JCIDS process, the Joint Capability Integrated Defense System, I think is maybe what that stands
Development
for, requirements writ large, and seeing that getting shepherded in such a way. If we can, like from a system standpoint, make that happen, which will really shock, the 36,000 people that work at the Pentagon every day. I mean, to me, that is going to be the massive proof in the pudding that we are actually changing the system in a meaningful, dramatic way, which will then give ownership and accountability to those senior leaders who are within these portfolios.
Well, I just have to say how important David's comment really is. If you work in the Defense Department, you see how hamstrung you really are by this inflexibility of money to be able to move. And if you work at the Pentagon, nothing happens unless you can get money aligned to what your purpose is. And so it's 1,700 line items. It's far from oversight. It's really micromanagement of the Pentagon from the Congress. And it's even worse than that because now they break every dollar into a color. So now I have a color I can spend on procurement. I can spend $1 on R&D, has a different color, operations and maintenance. So the 1,700 line items broken into specific colors mean you have practically no flexibility to move money to a different category where you might be able to save overall because you've identified a new technology that's cheaper, or you might have an urgent threat. But because the budget process started 3 years ago, and now I get it cut up into these very small, granules of a program element by color, you're completely constrained. So this could be a huge benefit addressing the budget component as David did. I could see a lot of flexibility to move much faster.
I'll only highlight it actually is much worse than Mike highlighted, because within those colors of funding, you have even more granular specifications. So within research, development, test, and engineering (RDT&E) funding, you actually have, about 7 or 8 different
6'3", 6'4"
sections, which then further hamstring. And it's Congress's way of ensuring that the department is spending broadly against a lot of different activities, and that we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket. But we see how well that's worked with the Joint Strike Fighter, right? Which is last I saw experiencing a $1 trillion shortfall. So even despite our best efforts to sort of spread out the funding to exercise a multi-dimensional military apparatus, we're just not good at it, right? The central planning thing, we're not good at it. And so we just need to admit it and try something different.
If we look across history, I don't think many people were very good at it.
True.
It's hard to do.
Yeah, so maybe just to make this, tangible for a novice like myself, maybe could we walk through what would this new process look like to field some new capability, and how would that compare to the old process, right? So for the F-35 or something, we had to go through the multi-year JCIDS process to collect requirements, and then it has kind of this inflexible system as you all were describing. But what might a new process look like to, field the next set of air capabilities or some other technology of your choice?
Well, let's take drones as an example, where the department is way behind where it would like to be. And you only have to look at what's happened in Ukraine to see that both Ukraine and Russia are producing somewhere between 4 and 5 million drones per year. I don't know what the equivalent number is for U.S. manufacturers and how much the Pentagon is buying, but I bet we're an order of magnitude below that. So way behind what we might need if we were called to into a conflict today. So we don't need to start with a JCIDS process, which in itself could take a couple of years to figure out what a joint requirement would be like for a drone. And we using the portfolio acquisition executive approach, you could imagine I might be able to have an office that's responsible for drones. So now I don't need to say, I need 17 types of drones, and I need to rationalize all the requirements for different endurance and payloads that they might. So it would be much easier to say, hey, I need these 4 or 5 capabilities that could all be managed in under one acquisition executive, with that executive making the trade-offs between how fast I can get those, what's available today, versus where I might want some development to occur. So I think that's tremendous advantage for the warfighter, for speed, and for the taxpayer. And then using a commercial solutions opening process, again, a proof point that's already been established by DIU and other organizations now. You can say, I can quickly sample what's available in the marketplace and quickly put companies on contract. We don't need to buy based on their say-so. They then go into a test program to see how they perform in the field. But we could certainly get that capability fielded within 1 year if it's commercial technology that already exists and just can be tested. And then, of course, we need to plan for how we're going to train folks to use those and what support might be required in the field. So that still will need to be done, but obviously can happen so much faster. And then we just talked about the budgeting benefits. If we see new technology come on quickly, we're able to evaluate that. We don't have to wait for another requirement, another budget cycle to occur. So you could imagine a much faster iteration for a commercial technology so that I can both field it quickly and then replace that as technology, evolves and we get better capability. All of it with the intent of how fast can I get a new capability to the warfighter. A little bit more complex if we're talking about, a ship or a fighter aircraft, but I think that's where the modular open system approach comes in, which is how we buy things in the commercial world with standards and interfaces among the subsystems. So I think if you had a design that you competed that included the interfaces, awarded that, and then there are subsystems built into that design, which then can be competed as soon as those technologies evolve, you could also have much faster upgrades for ships and fighter jets as examples.
So this is the difference between saying we need to have a drone that has a 5-foot wingspan and has this specific EW payload and this specific camera system. Now instead we can say we need to have the ability to conduct ISR within, a 10-mile radius. and now we can field whatever capability could fulfill that mission set, even if it doesn't have a 5-foot wingspan or it doesn't have the exact camera system that we were requesting in the initial set. Is that the right way to think about this?
Yeah, I think what you just described illustrated the JCIDS or requirements process. And then what the Secretary is also calling for is, okay, and I want faster buying. That's where something like the commercial solutions opening can come in. And then budgeting for that allows for me to shift to different priorities, adopt technology faster. That's where he's addressing the budgeting part of this. So all three of those can be accomplished with this set of reforms.
Yeah. I would just maybe add, with the requirements process, because of those specifications, it allowed then the budgeting team to sort of figure out what are the expected costs so that we're not going and trying to build an unaffordable military, right? But it assumes that everything is going to work out perfectly because we centrally planned it, to the widget. And we just know that that's not how things work. And what we sacrifice in pretending to have clairvoyance of the future is flexibility based on the technology evolution that is happening in the commercial world. Because again, we have to remember that the system acquisition approach was under the auspices that without the Department of War deciding that this technology needed to exist, it wouldn't. And now it's flipped on its head, and technology is just happening all over the place because the amount of research and development funding available to the world is just, it's no longer in Pentagon coffers, right? It just, that has all changed. And so maybe, like Maggie, to be specific on what does this change look like? In my mind, it is a massive reorganization of the department writ large. So let's take the Air Force. You have these major commands that are entrusted with organize, train, and equip. And so they help get the fighter pilots trained up, and then they make sure that they've got their fuel, and they set their training hours, and they also create the requirements for what the next generation of a fighter pilot might look like, or these things called 1067s, which are modifications to existing weapon systems. And then that gets routed up through the Pentagon, and then the Pentagon approves it, right? The higher headquarters. And then it goes down to the program offices, PEO fighter bomber. And now they've got this validated requirement, and then they can go compete it out amongst the industry based on all of those specifications that have been laid out through the 1067 process or otherwise. What I think really needs to happen is an integration of the operational commands and the acquisition commands into these cross-functional teams that have the requisite expertise to then make these decisions around the capability trade-offs based on like real-time feedback coming from the combatant commanders. And so we need to get away from this like game of telephone where things come from the field and they move all the way up to the Pentagon and then back down to the program office and then out to industry, and really creating just a much flatter organization filled with people that have the responsibility and accountability and decision-making prowess with the resident expertise inside of their control with the ability to then make it happen. And I would say the other thing that's kind of stood out to me in the Hegseth memo was the explicit call out of the contracting officer. So today, contracting officers, that is a functional discipline that awards and obligates the government. And they respond to their own chain of command. So even if you are a program executive officer, you don't have control of your contracting officers. They work for you from an operational standpoint, but administratively, they actually work for somebody else. And so it's kind of created its own fiefdom as they want to sort of protect themselves from doing something that maybe would be out of bounds. But I think what it does, what its kind of natural consequence is, you just have these disconnected organizations up and down the entire military apparatus. And all of those friction points just continue to insert time into the equation, right? And time is just like the one luxury we no longer have because we are so far behind and our legacy systems are costing so much in operations and maintenance that it's sort of eroding our military advantage.
So what are the implications of these reforms going to be for the traditional defense primes? And then what are the implications going to be for non-traditional vendors like startups?
Well, let's start with startups, which is what we focus on at Shield Capital. I think the emphasis on speed is a tremendous benefit to startup companies who have been frustrated with how cumbersome and how long it might take to get a contract with the Department of Defense. And I think this is part of the genius of these reforms is that they'll encourage a broader set of companies to participate in the national defense or national defense industrial base. So I think for startup companies, it's going to be more interesting to look at what opportunities there are to compete for commercial solutions openings, programs at the Pentagon. Because with this emphasis on speed, there should be a way to find out much quicker whether you're in the running, where you are in that competition, and eventually to, if you're selected, be paid for what you're doing. That we can't, overstate how important that's going to be. And I think one of the implications that the Secretary drew out was we need a broader defense industrial base. We need the primes, and we need to take advantage of the tremendous innovation that's happening across many different technologies, as David pointed out, that's happening in the innovation hubs around the country.
Yeah. And I'd say for the primes, I think this is equally important. Right now, the primes generally receive contracts that are, from a contract type called cost reimbursable. And so they're honestly incentivized to let these programs drag out because their profit margins are capped at 9 to 11%. And so the way that they make more profit is based on generating more revenue. And you get revenue on a cost reimbursable based on the number of hours of labor that you apply to a contract. And I can't tell you the amount of times when I was in a program office, not named Defense Innovation Unit, that no cost POP extensions, POP stands for period of performance, would be levied on these contracts just all the time. And we know that there is a cost to extending time, but it's not necessarily received in a way that is obvious to the acquisition system. Of course, we understand that there are downstream effects to the operational community. But I think if you can move the defense primes away from some of these contract types, if you can encourage and incentivize speed of delivery, what we'll see is significantly more partnerships between the primes and these venture-backed startups that are able to deliver quickly and allow the primes to be what they truly are, these system integrators that have incredible insights and understanding of the operational mission. They generally have a pretty deep bench of technologists. And what we need them to do is help these startups get better access into the weapon systems so that the operational community can be the beneficiaries of a lot of, indirect third-party capital investments into those startups, delivering products that work and that don't need to be built, bespoke to these government requirements. So it really is this incredible sea change that all of these things need to be working in concert, right? The requirements flexibility, the contracting flexibility, and the budgeting flexibility to really reimagine how the department might work.
Yeah, maybe one other benefit for the startup community could be the implementation of MOSA, again, modular open systems approach, something Congress, I think, put into law about 20 years ago, but the department really has not moved forward to incorporate that on a widespread basis. But the basic idea is standards so that you could be competing for subsystems rather than just the one program of record that would be for a large defense platform that one vendor might get for 50 years. So if that gets broken down the same way we think about the computer industry today, where I might be able to mix and match a graphics card, a processor, maybe someone like Dell is putting the whole thing together for me, but I'm not locked into one operating system or one set of components. So to the extent that is implemented, it would open up some of the larger defense platforms to more vendors, where traditionally that's been a difficult, bridge to cross for many of the suppliers to work only with a prime. This would open up that competition and make it more of a free access point for vendors on those subsystems for large defense platforms. That'll take years to play out, so that's not a near-term advantage. But over the long term, that should be much better for vendors, expand the defense industrial base, and certainly much better for the taxpayer.
Do we expect any organizations to resist these changes? And if so, how can we protect these changes from groups that might be opposed to them?
Well, I don't think anyone's going to be foolish enough to be vocal in their protest of this. But of course, we might see some folks dragging their feet. It's human nature not to want to change. There's a lot of big changes that are called for here. And it's going to be upsetting, as was pointed out in the Secretary's, he pointed out, to some business models. So it's going to require primes to change faster, probably. Honestly, if they change their business model, they will clearly benefit by this. So it's just going through that change could be challenging.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of different headquarter functions at you obviously have the Pentagon, right? And that's kind of what we'd call higher headquarters. But then, you've got all these other elements across the department, and they all sort of enjoy a little bit of local cachet. And so there's a lot of congressional representatives that care that their base is the headquarters for XYZ. And I think in this new paradigm where we're going to largely shrink some of those overhead organizations that are providing support elements, whether they're writing requirements or providing, program executive office like functions. If we don't consolidate the sheer volume of these things, we're not going to get the residual benefit of a faster, leaner, more agile system. And so I could see a lot of different bases that are going to be very concerned about what this memo portends for their importance on across the department. And so, I think this is going to be a massive challenge. It's going to require a lot of compromise and trade-offs. But I hope that congressional representatives and local constituencies at these bases recognize that we can no longer afford the luxury of having this fragmented decision-making system. It's just not working.
How do we actually implement these changes? I mean, it's one thing for the secretary to go up and talk about all the things that are going to change, but obviously the department is comprised of more than 1 million people. I know a lot of people talk about kind of the frozen middle of people who have been there for a long time doing things one way. How do we incentivize groups both inside and outside of government to actually make these changes a reality?
So a big part of it was discussed by the Secretary in terms of what happens next. So between the Undersecretary for Research Engineering, Secretary Michael, and then for Acquisition and Sustainment, Secretary Duffy, they're actually going to now need to put on paper specific guidance. And it'll be, imperative to spell out, okay, what changed to get to a portfolio acquisition executive, for example, what things go away if we're going to create more accountability in that single person. So those are the kind of details that now need to be specified. I think Secretary called for that within the next 90 days. So that'll be a more detailed implementation plan. He called for a change to the acquisition university to be now a warfighter acquisition university. And that's where the training occurs for the contract professionals. He also called for that to be more experiential. I think that's a great move so that they could actually be involved in, you could imagine, an exercise where you're working on a specific program, where before a lot of the curriculum was about compliance with federal acquisition regulations, which I think Secretary called out how onerous that was. I think it's 2,000 pages that are federal acquisition regulations, another couple thousand pages of how to implement those regulations. So very complex process. It'd be great to simplify that, which is what's been called for the executive orders, for example, that the president issued, and now making sure that the curriculum taught at the Warfighter Acquisition University actually backs that up, makes it more experiential. Hopefully the contracting officers that David spoke to a moment ago, they will be part of the cross-functional team at a portfolio acquisition executive's office to really be figuring out how do we move faster. So those are the kind of things we'll have to see, what specific guidance is given, how the training changes. I'd also add the general counsels are going to have to be involved. They've been traditionally a very risk-averse part of the Pentagon, making sure nobody gets into trouble. But that obviously doesn't move you forward with taking more acquisition risk. So I think that whole set of folks that we just talked about, both the training and seeing how leadership behaves, rewarding the right behavior, and hopefully, keeping people accountable if they're not moving forward with the directive that's been issued.
Yeah, I would hope that within this portfolio scorecard that's going to be created around this new acquisition paradigm, that it not only provides like mandatory goals that you have to hit, like small business concerns, right? Or you got to obligate by a certain date, or, you'll get punished in the financial spring execution review, like all that stuff. But that they also say, like, if you deliver these things early and quickly, we're going to potentially promote you faster, or we're going to imbue you with more responsibility, or you're going to see your scope of authority increase. And I think those are areas that would really motivate the workforce in a way that would be very different from how it is today, where it's really just about being compliant, not screwing up. And as long as I hit the checklist of going to these trainings and accumulating experiences in these types of roles, then I will get promoted. And so we really need to get it to outcomes based versus outputs. And that's going to be a huge task. And I think one area that we don't often do a very good job of in the military is celebrating people who do things the right way and get incredible results, and then rewarding them accordingly with things that actually matter, not like a simple decoration or here's a day off right from work. I mean, generally those people don't want days off from work. They want to keep doing the job. And so I think we just have to get creative and try to apply commercial best practices that seem to resonate, because like the workforce is the most important part of any of these reforms. And so if they're not properly incentivized and motivated, it's only going to be pieces of paper and like nice speeches.
So speaking of celebrating organizations that are doing things right, can you talk to what are some of the existing programs or organizations that are already acquiring technology in a manner consistent with this new policy that the rest of the department can learn from?
Yeah, well, so Mike and I are obviously big fans of Defense Innovation Unit and the work that we did there. Maybe I'll just point out in the blog piece that I posted last night, I highlight the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office, right? They were established in 2003. They've been around a long time. And it was they were developed because there was some pretty compelling characters who were unsatisfied with how slow things were going in the acquisition system. And they knew that they could deliver capability to various organizations faster, better, cheaper. The organization has had a lot of success. And I will say I've never worked there, so everything I'm going to tell you is based on reputation. But I found it extremely odd, and I highlight in the blog piece, that they were given the B-21 bomber program when there is already a program office at a base near Dayton, Ohio, that has a program executive office specific to the bombers. Now, why would it be given to the Rapid Capability Office if organizationally it should already be somewhere? There's nothing rapid about building the B-21. So clearly there was a dissatisfaction with how the culture of a program office was executing programs. And so instead of dealing with the situation head on, we just give somebody else the program to execute. And I think that's the wrong approach. We shouldn't then let the PEO for bombers continue to persist indefinitely if they can't even be trusted by the higher headquarters to execute something that would be in their jurisdiction. And this is not a one-off or a two-off. I mean, this is happening all around the department day in and day out, which is why you see these exceptional offices being set up to go around the system. And I think one of the things that Secretary Hegseth said is, we can't go around the system every time. At a certain point, you just have to recreate the system to be what you need it to be. And I think that's like going to be a massive undertaking. And it's going to upset people. It's going to be uncomfortable. But we know that the status quo is not working.
It clearly goes to the principle that was called for, which is accountability. We need accountability for decisions. And one of the additional comments the Secretary made, or reinforcing mechanisms, is we're going to have people in these positions longer. So the idea with the portfolio acquisition executive is 4-year minimum term with a 2-year extension. And that will be in contrast to what traditionally has been a 3-year rotation for folks. And anyone that has been around acquisition, you need to be around to see some of the implications of the decisions you make. I think many people would attribute the success of the nuclear submarine program to the fact that Admiral Rickover was there for such a long time. Long time decisions to be made, and he was able to oversee the program kind of soup to nuts, and that has an impact on how fast you can get capability delivered.
So what are some of the capabilities where you all think these changes in the acquisition process will actually make the most difference in getting high quality technology into the hands of our warfighters quickly?
Well, I think clearly from our experience at Defense Innovation Unit, we're excited about the adoption of commercial technology. It's going to make a huge difference there. So, everything we've talked about, software, autonomous systems, sensors from space, resilient communications, the list goes on because there are more and more commercial technologies that are going to be important in warfighting. For all of those, it represents a pathway that's going to be much more attractive, not only much faster to get capability to warfighters, but much faster to get vendors into the Department of Defense and hopefully to help with building companies. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think anything that deals with autonomous capability is ripe for commercial integration and a need to sort of rethink the acquisition approach. The private sector has sunk billions and billions of dollars. I mean, you just think about the Waymos that are driving around the street today. I mean, that was not a simple, Air Force research lab project that got a couple $1 million over a 5-year period, and then voila, you now have autonomous driving vehicles. We just don't have the deep pockets within our research and development apparatus to develop these technologies anymore. And so partnering becomes absolutely necessary. And I think what we saw, and maybe I'll just, double down on what Mike said about the space community. I still remember in 2016 when now Major General Stephen Bucky Buteau was going around and trying to highlight all of the great commercial space technology that was largely created out of the zero interest rate phenomenon, right, known as ZIRP. And while not all those companies have necessarily borne out in the public markets, they absolutely have had a dramatic impact on the battlefield, especially in Ukraine. And the department was very resistant to working with them in the beginning. Now they have all kinds of commercial offices, right, up and down. But in those early days, it was definitely, not that easy to get them to partner. And so we've come a long way, but I still think there are a lot of program offices that refuse to sort of think about anything other than their system acquisition approach towards validated requirements, cost plus contract types, and awarding things in a classified environment to your very traditional defense industry base.
So finally, to close us out, I'm going to ask you both the question that I ask at the end of almost all these podcasts, which is, what advice do you both have for startups in order to navigate this new apparatus, in order to successfully build technology for the national security domain?
Well, the advice will be very similar to what we've talked about probably before, which is there's going to be many more opportunities in defense. It's not going to be overnight, perhaps, that all these changes will be implemented. We talked about kind of the time frames. It'll take years for some of these to fully work their way through. But the whole investment thesis behind SHIELD is that there are going to be dual use opportunities. And of course, that means great commercial opportunities for this technology, but also national security applications. And this will turbocharge the Department of Defense in terms of how fast they want to get after those and the recognition of how important these commercial technologies are. So I would say keep your eyes peeled for what opportunities come. Many companies in our portfolio and in other venture portfolios are already watching what's happening with the Defense Innovation Unit solicitations, rapid capability offices that are reaching out. I think that's going to become more the norm, whereas before it might have been more the exception relative to total defense expenditures. So as that occurs, there's going to be more opportunity for more companies. It's going to be a very exciting time. I think we're at the front end of a secular change in terms of defense spending that's going to really pull through a lot more commercial technologies and new vendors. So I think that's tremendously exciting.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's well said. So I'm going to take this question in a completely different direction. Do not, if I'm a startup, do not take this level of advocacy for granted. There is going to be a very vocal minority of companies who want things to remain exactly the way that they are. And they have been partnered with their congressional and Senate representatives for a long time. If you don't engage with Congress, they don't know you exist. And so you need to develop a relationship with them to let them know that these types of changes are absolutely critical to your company being able to deliver capability that the warfighter can then use operationally. We all know that technology that is relevant today is in large part built by venture-backed startups. But venture-backed startups do not have a seat at the table when it comes to the overall defense industry base. It is at its early stages, but these things go a lot faster when the whole industry is working together against the incumbents who largely want to keep things the same. And just to kind of put this not so abstractly, I've been working on the Small Business Innovation Research reauthorization, and Senator Ernst has been promoting Innovate Act to try to help the types of companies that are going to deliver capabilities. But this entrenched community of cybermills, of which there aren't that many, have been able to hold a certain side of the aisle hostage because they are so loud, so well organized, and have enough funding to be able to hire their own lobbyist entity, that the Innovate Act is stuck and stalled. And it's because these Congress people that actually have a lot of startups in their community, they just are not as well organized, and they don't know that they're sort of cutting their nose to spite their face at this point in time. And so I guess just to end it, you need to continue to advocate. We're all doing this together, but don't take it for granted.
It's a great point. You got to keep in mind how your congressional representation can help you with your agenda.
Great. Well, David, Mike, thank you both so much for joining last minute to break down what is happening in the world of defense or warfighter acquisition reform. I really appreciate you both coming on. I know I learned a lot. It really helped clarify a lot of the many, many acronyms and wonky policy changes in this memo. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maggie.
You bet.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Mission Matters podcast from Shield Capital. Tune in again next month for another conversation with founders building for a mission that matters. And if you yourself are looking to build in the national security space, please reach out to us.